Hey, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. Coming era of evidence-based medicine is going to take this industry and turn it on its head. Now, for all intents and purposes, we actually should be in this era today. The technology is there, the data is there, and frankly, the benefit to patients and outcomes has been widely understood for years. But the reality is that that in and of itself is not enough to get us to that future state. What is happening right now is that there is a fundamental shift in the business model with how drug therapies are brought to market, how they're supported in market, and how they're reimbursed. And it is that shift in that business model that is making the era of evidence-based medicine essential for that to continue. That's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about what kind of an impact that's going to have. But first, let's take a glimpse into the future. So when we talk about the era of evidence-based medicine, we're talking about an era where patient data, clinical, non-clinical, is collected not in a controlled trial, but rather we're looking at how well therapies work on people in the real world, hence real-world data. And we're able to collect it on an ongoing basis, we're able to collect it on a wide scale, we're able to collect it at a granular enough level that we can get to very small patient subpopulations. And the other thing that's probably most critical is that it's widely available. And that existence of real-world data is going to be used to not just see how well therapies are working in people, but it's also going to be used to support the analytics and the prediction modeling to be able to say how well a therapy will likely work in a patient given their characteristics. And that in and of itself is going to create a number of shifts in the market. Number one, if you look at the top, payers are now going to be able to make pharmaceutical companies far more accountable for the outcomes that they've committed to get the drugs listed in the first place. Second big shift is that the level of subjectivity that exists in how therapies are selected today is going to be radically marginalized in the future. Now, probably one of the outcomes is going to be we're going to have improved treatment outcomes for patients. And you'll notice that I didn't indicate here that it's going to be improved patient experience or improved patient journeys. That omission is intentional. But we are expecting that outcomes will improve for patients. So I mentioned that it's the evolving business model of how we bring drugs to market that is going to drive a great deal of this. And we'll take a look at that now. We're going to look at that in the context within the pharmaceutical industry, which is a great precursor to what we see here. What you see on this slide is kind of three phases as to how the drug development and bringing drugs to market, how that model is evolving over time. And I'll walk you through it here, and we're going to focus on the left side of the screen. Everybody's probably familiar with that blockbuster era of pharmaceuticals. It was a time when access and reimbursement was quite wide, and drugs became synonymous with a specific indication. Prozac equals depression. Leukemia equals Gleevec. Joint pain and muscle pain that's chronic equals Celebrex. And the whole strategy of the industry at the time was to maximize reach. Get as many bloody doctors scripting the product as you possibly can and drive volume. Make sure those doctors are writing as many possible scripts as you can. This was a very difficult time in the industry not to make gobs of money. And we saw the emergence of the sales rep, the professional sales team, and outreach mechanisms to the community to get doctors favorable towards their therapies. That was a fantastic time to be an investor in pharmaceutical companies. It was a fantastic time to be in the industry, but all good times eventually come to an end. That came to an end with the patent cliff, and it also came to an end with the emergence of all kinds of what they called Me Too drugs. And we moved into an era that we're calling kind of the patent cliff era. And we're a few years into that right now. And what's happening is that pharmaceutical companies, when they're bringing their drugs to market, they're realizing that doctors and patients alike have numerous choice of what kind of therapies they can select for any given condition. And in an era where the profitability isn't what it used to be, the margins have shrunk and the resources are now quite limited, pharmaceutical companies are now having to focus on very distinct markets. Where can we actually win and what kind of sub-markets can we own? And it's no longer about deriving volume. A big part of the strategy is around deriving value. The cost of acquiring patients, especially specialty care patients in this environment, has become so high that the need to keep that patient on drug for as long as you can has become paramount. So some of the things that have come along in this environment is now we see the advent of the patient support program. Programs that the drug companies run, either in-house or externally, meant to get a patient on drug as quickly as possible and to keep them on that drug for as long as possible. The other piece that you're seeing is that drug companies now invest very heavily in their market access functions internally in order to make sure that they continue to have strong listing agreements and to make sure that they can continue to have strong pricing to keep themselves going. But all this is going to give way to probably the more exciting era, which we call the accountability era. So you have drug companies fighting to try and create differentiation and to create value among their products. At the same time, we have patient support programs that are collecting a tremendous amount of data from patients to justify the fact that their therapies are actually working and that their therapies are able to produce the results that they're claiming to deliver. And all of that's going to lead us into that new era where payers, those private insurance companies and the publicly funded drug plans, coming out with contingency-based agreements where they will say, I'm okay reimbursing this drug on these outcomes, but if it's less than that, we've got a problem. Great example is the cure for Hep C that came out. $600 a pill, must be taken every day for 12 straight weeks. Clinical trial results came back and said it worked 97% of the time. And payers were quite impressed. They say, you know what, $600 a pill, price is steep, cure Hep C, and I get the fact that 3 out of every 100 people it's not going to work on, I can live with that. But after the 4th, after the 5th, after the 6th out of 100, we are not paying, and we're going to demand a rebate to cover those costs after the fact if your drug is so good. So the onus has started to shift to the pharmaceutical companies, not their physicians, to keep patients adherent, compliant, and ultimately delivering those results. A couple of things to take away as we're seeing this business model kind of unfold. We look at the blockbuster era and compare it to the kind of patent cliff era. The business model looks a little bit different on the surface, but in reality, they're somewhat the same. It's about trying to convince doctors to prescribe your drug. And the analogy that I might use is, this blockbuster era is like a 1930s automobile, and the patent cliff era is like a 1990 automobile. They might look very different on the surface, but ultimately, it's the internal combustion engine powered by gasoline, which powers a drivetrain, which turns the wheels. In the accountability era, that's like comparing that 1990 automobile to the 2019 Tesla. Maybe on the surface there's some similarities, but underneath these are radically different mechanisms for propulsion. Last point I'll leave you with on this slide. In this kind of era, every patient has value. Patient goes on your drug, doesn't work that well for them, they go off the drug, it's still a sale. Patient goes on the drug, the outcomes that they get are suboptimal, still a sale. In the latter era, patient goes on the drug, it doesn't work or it doesn't work as well as it should. That is now a point of evidence that a payer can point to that your drug does not deliver value or your drug is garbage. And that far outweighs any short-term revenue that a drug company may get from getting a patient on the drug that wasn't well suited for them to be on the drug in the first place. And that is a radical shift in how the drug development industry is now looking at the market and what they're seeing for the future. This move from blockbuster era to patent cliff era was largely driven by, obviously, the patent cliff, but also the influx of Me Too medications. This is a bigger shift from the patient-driven to the outcomes-driven piece, and there's a couple of big trends that are driving that. Three I'll focus on here, and we'll start with the first one, and this is the fact that payers are desperately trying to control drug costs by limiting access to drugs. We live in a market where 70% of all prescriptions are now filled with cheaper generic drugs. Yet the total amount that we spend on prescription drugs continues to rise, and that's largely driven today by specialty care drugs. And what's scaring the hell out of payers is they're looking at the market and they say, what's in the pipeline isn't primary care anymore, it's now specialty care. High-priced, many times considered breakthrough therapy, expensive drugs that are coming through. And they're looking at it and they say, on current trends, growth on just the specialty side of this equation is going to grow by close to half. So that need, that level of austerity, that kind of trying to reduce access to drugs or making sure that only the right candidates get drugs is one of the key drivers that's at play right now. Kind of related to that whole austerity issue is now that need for health delivery systems, hospitals, to do more with less. I'm from Toronto, so we see a lot of that right now. That's happening with the healthcare restructuring, but it's happening not just across the country, but many parts of the world. So the need to leverage data to understand how we can find efficiencies to do more with less is also a big driver. And at the same time, the last trend is the basic business need for pharmaceutical companies to demonstrate value and to drive values in ways that they never actually had to do before. This is the big trends in the market, and we're already starting to see major areas of traction in a number of different healthcare providers. I won't go into everything that's listed here, but I will highlight a couple of pieces. So, on the top left-hand corner, Gemini, that's from St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. They've invested heavily in a team of data scientists and clinicians who are pouring through patient chart data that's going back about 4 years to try and understand how they can predict outcomes ranging from readmissions to infections to standardized procedures in the hospital. Anybody hear the federal government's technology supercluster initiative? $1 billion. Federal government assigned close to $1 billion, and that's real $1 billion, not $1 billion that they're planning to spend in 5 years' time. They're going to allocate it over 20 years. $1 billion that they've decided to earmark to fund consortiums of private and public companies who are trying to find efficiencies in healthcare. One of the big ones went to a consortium based out of Vancouver, made up of healthcare and technology companies, and they're trying to build a common health data platform in order to move us that much closer to the evidence-based era. Chances are, most people in this room are part of a trial. That is, if you carry an iPhone. On your iPhone, you'll see an app called Health. It's a standard app that's put on. It's white and it has a pink heart in the top right-hand corner. That Health app is used to collect data relating to movements and relating to other aspects of your physical activity. If you're someone who has other healthcare apps already on your phone, maybe from another patient support program or otherwise, that app can actually tap into those apps and profile what kind of conditions that you as a user may have. And that's being done to facilitate trial recruitment. Anybody that's interested in more, go into Google, type Apple, and then type the word research kit, all one word. And you'll be amazed at what you find in terms of clinical trial recruitment just from their own user base. And last thing I'll point out here, so every pharmaceutical company globally has made significant investments in developing real-world evidence generation capabilities. What's interesting, even affiliates that are operating in the Canadian market, about a third of them now have invested in teams to try and generate real-world evidence specific to Canadian payers. Now, what's going to keep this moving is the fact that we actually have a lot of enablers in place that are going to start accelerating this forward. And I'm going to highlight a couple of here. First, I'm going to talk about homomorphic encryption. So one of the big barriers in doing healthcare analytics has always been the privacy concern. We're using patient-level data that we're trying to analyze, and we have great concerns about how we might share that data with other sources to amalgamate it. Now, we've always had strong encryption technology that's been able to mask data through acquisition, that's been able to mask data that's being stored, so if you are hacked, the data is encrypted. But it always fell off in the fact that in order to actually do any analytics on the data, you ultimately had to de-encrypt the data in order to do the analytics. Homomorphic encryption actually ticks that last box. It allows you to do analytics on health data while it is still encrypted, and therefore preserving privacy for patients. That kind of leads into one of the other big pieces. So as you have patient-level data and health data generated by so many different sources and parts, integration becomes very, very important. Homomorphic encryption helps on that front. The other things that are happening is standardization in clinical objects so that we can actually link data from numerous sources and clinical references are always consistent. The other piece in health data, the most rich forms of insight have not been specific data that's been captured, but actually free-form notes that have been written by clinicians or patients. We now have natural language processing technology that's able to read notes intelligibly and actually turn that into data elements within standard objects that allows us to integrate that data far more effectively. And finally, Emr Proliferation. What's actually going to unlock that potential is the fact that we can do data integration, and EMR is now over 85% use in primary care. Part of the problem is that there were, it seems like there was as many EMR service providers as there were clinicians using them. So coming up with a standard to integrate that has always been a major challenge. But with some of the other aspects of technology that we have, we're able to integrate that. These things are taking massive barriers away for use of data in order to create that evidence-based era. Okay, a lot on this slide. Getting to that point of evidence-based medicine doesn't happen overnight. It's not like we hit a critical mass and all of a sudden it's here. There are a number of steps that take place as we're trying to get to that point. And I've done this in the context of that stages of the business model that we looked at a few slides ago. Don't have to read everything that's on here, but a couple of things to note. First of all, you can tell by the arrows that as things happen, very few things happen independently. Most of the advances, the technology introductions, the changes in business process, these are all interrelated pieces. As far as the color coding goes, everything that you see there in green represents a commercial activity. Everything that you see in blue represents a medical activity. Everything you see in red relates to an activity relating to payer or reimbursement. And one of the things that we'll see as we move forward to that evidence-based era is that we're going to see a move away from that traditional type of commercial model, that very sales rep type driven, to more medical, which is actually going to be a stepping stone to where the payers are ultimately dictating what is happening in the market. So a couple of things in terms of what this means. I'm going to look at 3 different players and explain how things are going to unfold. We're going to start with the drug makers. One of the things that we will see, drug makers used to have their competitive advantage being their pipeline. We have these molecules under development. We are going to bring certain things to market. That's going to shift a little bit. One of the big pieces that drug companies are going to invest in is the patient support programs. They need that on a practical level to generate real-world data, but they also need it on a practical level to make sure that once they get a patient on a therapy, they're able to keep that patient on therapy, keep them compliant to the therapy, and really understand how it is that that therapy is reaching certain endpoints for that patient. They also need it as a source of business intelligence. These models are going to dictate the predictive modeling that will say what types of patients are actually well suited for a given therapy. What can we expect in terms of certain outcomes? What are we prepared to commit to with a payer in order to enter into a contingency-based agreement? As that moves on, you're going to find that just like drugs can't be all things to all people any longer, patient support programs that they develop can't be all things to all people. You will see some drug companies develop patient support programs that are very adept at supporting people with mental health and depression issues. You'll also see patient support programs extremely well suited for geriatrics or youth or other types of patient types. That increasingly will become a competitive advantage for the drug companies. And the expectation is that they will look at their pipelines and say, we have a tremendous infrastructure to bring products to market that help geriatrics. And we've got these molecules in our pipeline that have absolutely nothing to do with this patient segment. And someone else that has a program that can reach those people and support them well are going to get far better value out of that molecule than we are. So we're going to sell that molecule. And we'll use the proceeds of that one to in-license or outrightly buy other molecules that are actually a strong fit with our programs, because we can actually get a whole lot more value out of those programs or out of those molecules with our programs than someone else can. And one of the things that we expect to start to see happening is as these programs become more and more valuable to drug companies, they will have an added incentive to try and derive as much value as they can for themselves. And one comparison is Air Canada, who did something very similar with Aeroplan. This will get exciting. Companies are going to be far more aggressive in how they go after listing agreements. Those that have the better data will be able to take the better risk, or at least mitigate their risk. One of the downsides we might see is as the market becomes more volatile, There may be many pharmaceutical companies that simply choose Canada. It's 1.8% of the world market, and we're not going to enter here if that's what the market looks like. For payers, one word, control. Payers will be in the driver's seat in this new era. And their reimbursement rules are really going to dictate what kind of specialty medications many patients receive at the end of the day. Finally, for patients, good news is the therapy is going to be quite tailored, but their choice is going to be somewhat limited. And some of the questions that we'll need to ask ourselves, if you have a therapy, who is the person that decides what's optimal? We talk about some cancer drugs where a patient needs to decide there's one option, it has a 20% chance of working, and I'll live 5 years or more, and another option that has an 80% chance of working, but it'll only give me 1 extra year. Who makes the call on that front? So in closing, future is going to get very interesting. This is from perspective of myself, that's a consultant to the industry, this is fun times. But ultimately, patients, more of them are going to get the right therapy for the right patient. I think we'll be able to see a lot more efficiency with hospitals and their protocols. The big question mark, when subjectivity exits the equation, many physicians will need to see their roles changed. Transition can be opportunity. And if anybody would like to chat, I'll be around at the post-conference as well. With that, I'll say thank you very much.